Hello, everyone. My name is Bohdan Klid. I'd like to welcome everyone who's here online um, for our colloquium on Holodomor Denial in the 1940s, 1980s, and 2020s. We have three speakers today um, online from different parts of the world. We have Dr. Henry Prown, Dr. Roman Siromskyi and Schenk-Day, and each of the presenters will be giving a paper um, more or less limited to 25 minutes. And afterwards, we'll have a question and answer session. Of course, Holodomor Denial began with the 1930s, but this colloquium is examining the phenomenon which occurred later. So we're just about ready to begin. I'm here with Dr. Henry Prown in one room, so it's a little tight, but I think we'll manage. Um, I think we'll go with the first speaker will be Dr. Prown chronologically. His talk is on the 1940s. Um, he is a research associate with the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and also an instructor in the Department of History, Classics, and Religion at the University of Alberta. His research examines the relationship between Stalinism and the Anglo-American media in the mid-20th century. His topic of his presentation is Holodomor Denial in the 1940s through the lens of Orwell. Dr. Prown.
Thank you so much, Bogdan. So if you all will just give me a minute to get my presentation set up here, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, hopefully you all should be able to see my presentation. I just am so grateful that everyone took the time to join today. I'd like to thank the event organizers here at CIUS, as well as my fellow panelists, and of course, our august chair, Bogdan. Thank you so much. And as he mentioned today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about kind of the longer history of Holodomor denial in the 1940s, a time that people weren't necessarily talking a lot about this topic, and that's why I think it's kind of an interesting time period to examine. Now, one summer day in 1972, the scholar Ian Angus made a rather astounding discovery. While digging through the dusty archives at the University College London's library, he came across a folder resting inconspicuously amongst the personal papers of the great British novelist George Orwell. And the decaying typeset manuscript within this kind of set of folders had obviously been left untouched for many decades, as when Angus carefully removed the paperclip which bound its pages together, a ring of rust remained firmly imprinted below. You can see that in the upper left here. And what he found as he slowly leafed through these pages must have shocked him. For this brief 8-page essay titled The Freedom of the Press revealed itself to be the long-lost, unpublished introduction to the first edition of Orwell's celebrated classic Animal Farm. This allegorical fable, which satirized the Russian or the October Revolution rather, and Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, had proven deeply controversial at the time of its writing in the winter of 1943 to 44. Indeed, four separate publishers, including his prior publisher, rejected the piece under advice from the British government, which did not want to offend its then Soviet allies. As one editor explicitly explained in a letter to Orwell, his biting critiques would no doubt give offense to many people, and particularly to anyone who is a bit touchy, as undoubtedly the Russians are. Evidently, this censorship had irked the novelist because in The Freedom of the Press, Orwell castigated what he called the English intelligentsia for their timidity and dishonesty in the face of social and political pressure. And what followed was really a spirited defense of free speech, even in the midst of wartime. If liberty means anything at all, he passionately argued, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. However, he had chided in warning, from that tradition, many intellectuals are visibly turning away. They have accepted the principle that a book should be published or suppressed, praised or damned, not on its merits, but according to political expediency. And specifically, Orwell believed that Britain's best and brightest had been enticed and entranced by the expediencies and expressions of Soviet power. What is disquieting is when the USSR and its policies are concerned, one cannot expect intelligent criticism, or even in many cases, plain honesty from liberal writers and journalists who are under no direct pressure to falsify their opinions. Stalin is sacrosanct, and certain aspects of his policy must not be seriously discussed. This rule has been almost universally observed since 1941, but it had operated to an even greater extent than is sometimes realized for 10 years earlier than that. Events in Russia and events elsewhere were to be judged by different standards. The endless executions in the purges of 1936 to 1938 were applauded by lifelong opponents of capital punishment. And it was considered equally proper to publicize famines when they happened in India and to conceal them when they happened in Ukraine. This is him writing in probably early 1944. And to be sure, during the first half of the 20th century, famine had been a regular occurrence in both India, which was then at the tail end of the wartime Bengal famine, and Ukraine, which would face severe and deadly food shortages in the Second World War's immediate aftermath. But while Orwell's prior reference to the highly publicized purges of the mid 1930s would have been kind of widely understood among Western audiences in the mid 1940s, his subsequent reference to this previously concealed history of famine in Ukraine had by the mid 1940s become rather more obscure. And this is really because the concerted concealment effort, rather, had for the most part worked. And the mass atrocity, which is now commonly termed the Holodomor, in the course of which millions of Ukrainians were starved to death by the Stalinist regime in the early 1930s, and millions more persecuted and displaced, seem to have resolutely receded into the dense fog of forgotten tragedy, kind of widely and reputedly becoming known as this hidden famine. And the reasons for this are multifarious and the subject of much of my own research, actually. But kind of for the purposes of corroborative summation, you might say, and brevity, I will simply quote the Holodomor historian James Mace, who labeled the Soviet cover-up as perhaps the single most successful denial of genocide in history. And today, we'll be discussing a little bit about the dynamics of that denial in the context of the 1940s by considering the writings and work of George Orwell. Now, for reasons entirely unknown, Orwell never ended up submitting his fiery introduction to Secker and Warburg, the firm that eventually published Animal Farm in 1945, but its anti-authoritarian message nonetheless resonates throughout the book and throughout his follow-up 1949 novel titled 1984. For instance, in one particularly haunting passage in that latter dystopian text, almost certainly, as we'll discuss, inspired by the Stalinist state's frequent distortion of history, Orwell famously and foresightedly muses that who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And I would suggest that more broadly, this question of control, whether of political economic control, of sociocultural control, or of media narrative control, which is really what we're talking about today, lays at the core of the Holodomor, of its implementation, and of its interpretation in both the short and longer term. And the story of this tragedy and really crime is the story of how these systems of control were wielded and weaponized against the peoples of Ukraine by an imperialist dictatorial regime in Moscow, of how the peoples of Ukraine reacted to this and resisted, and of how the resultant crimes were hidden and suppressed by its perpetrators and their overseas boosters, which was really what was concerning Orwell at this point. And I would suggest that it's very much a story of the past, of course, but also of the present and the future, of both Ukraine and the world for famines, mass atrocities, and the parties which simultaneously manufacture and deny them are as entrenched today as they were at the dawn of recorded history, and certainly as they were in the 20th century. This is also, incidentally enough, a story that Orwell himself continued to return to in his writing, both fiction and nonfiction. As the former UN official Bohdan Klid recently and cogently observed, Orwell is not always appreciated as much as he deserves for recognizing the importance of Ukraine and the suffering it endured. And really, the purpose of this ongoing research project of mine is to explore the extent of Orwell's recognition of Ukraine and its suffering, its resonance in his work, and also the reaction it garnered from what I would argue were the foremost purveyors of Holodomor denial at the time, namely communists themselves, to reveal the abiding importance of the tragedy to the output of one of the 20th century's greatest and most haunting literary minds. And through this kind of close analysis of Orwell's nonfiction writing, will demonstrate that the Holodomor and its denial were key to his understanding of totalitarian systems in general, which would be then displayed in his fiction writing and also in the response to it. And I should note that kind of very little, surprisingly little work has been done about the key part of the 32-33 famine and its denial, the part that this played in Orwell's thinking about the present and the past, or about the dystopian futures he created. Aside from this excellent Kiev Post op-ed by Mr. Nihilo, few seem to have noted the broader connection. The significance, I would say, of modernity's most cogent and clear-minded Cassandra, a man often regarded as, I'm quoting here from Timothy Garton Ash in The Guardian, the most influential political writer of the 20th century, the significance of such a man deriving his dystopian depictions from the Holodomor and its denial to the kind of specific field of Holodomor studies, to the scholarly world more generally, and really to the general public, is, in my mind, pretty self-evident. In Orwell's work, we really begin to witness Ukraine move from the sort of purported historical and contemporary periphery to the very center of the modern world and its machinations. The premise of this project is really, admittedly, rather simple. I'm a simple-minded man and a simple-minded historian. Basically, I'm just asking this question, what role did the Holodomor play in Orwell's fiction and nonfiction writing? And my methodology is kind of to interrogate this question through a close analysis of Orwell's work and contemporary communist responses to that work by considering what I'm calling the three R's: Orwell's recognition of and commentary on the Holodomor across more than a decade of nonfiction writing and across, as we'll see in a minute, numerous individual cases, the resonance of the Holodomor in Orwell's fiction writing, both as a key narrative element in Animal Farm, but also as an inspiration for his conception of totalitarianism in 1984. And also looking at communist media outlets who, again, as I've shown in my past work, were some of the foremost purveyors of Holodomor denial in Anglo-American media, and how they quickly realized the underlying anti-Stalinist and anti-collectivization themes rather, of Orwell's work, and prompting kind of a very harsh public reaction in their press outlets. The sort of evidentiary basis that I'm going on here, of course, materials from Orwell's archive, diaries, memos, unpublished manuscripts and typescripts, his published writings. There's kind of a series of rather extensive collections of these published writings. This is nonfiction mostly, as well as the archives of communist newspapers from the time period, particularly the American version of the Daily Worker, which I use over the British version. There's also a British Daily Worker. These are the official newspapers of the communist parties in their respective countries. But Orwell kind of had this almost personal feud with the British Daily Worker. So to ensure that we're setting aside personal issues and just looking at political issues, I considered his reception in the American version. So what does this entail specifically? More than half a dozen references across a decade of Orwell's nonfiction writing, specifically to what he called the Ukraine famine in the decade prior to the publication of his fiction novels. many having to do with this question of its kind of dismissal or denial by Westerners. And I'll just point to a few examples here. The fog of lies and misinformation that surrounds such subjects as the Ukraine famine, the Spanish Civil War, Russian policy in Poland, and so forth is not due entirely to conscious dishonesty, but any writer or journalist who is fully sympathetic to the USSR, sympathetic, that is, in the way the Russians themselves would want him to be, does have to acquiesce in deliberate falsification on important issues. Huge events like the Ukraine famine of 1933 involving the deaths of millions of people have actually escaped the attention of the majority of English Russophiles. All the hideous controversies about the purges, the 5-year plans, the Ukraine famine, etc., have simply passed over the average newspaper reader's head. These are all examples from the early 1940s. Revealingly, of the 9 explicit references to historical or ongoing famine events in the 4-volume collected essays of George Orwell, 7 or 78% are to the Ukraine famine. And when Orwell uses the word famine in any context at all, and here I'm including like when he talks about a famine of potatoes in his own garden, half the time it's a reference to the Ukraine famine. These statistics, by the way, exclude this unpublished Introduction to Animal Farm, where, of course, he discusses it as well. Subsequent to such nonfiction references across almost a decade of commentary, Orwell makes repeated allusions both to famine and its denial in Animal Farm in 1984. Here's kind of a key passage. For days at a time, the animals had nothing to eat but chaff and mangles. Starvation seemed to stare them in the face. It was vitally necessary to conceal. Conceal, by the way, is the same verb he uses in his unpublished introduction to describe what had been done to famine in Ukraine. To conceal this fact from the outside world. Emboldened by the collapse of the windmill, the human beings were inventing fresh lies about Animal Farm. Once again, it was being put about that all the animals were dying of famine and disease, and they were continually fighting amongst themselves and had resorted to cannibalism and infanticide. Napoleon, the stand-in for Stalin, was well aware of the bad results that might follow if the real facts of the food situation were known. And he decided to make use of Mr. Whymper to spread a contrary impression. Mr. Whymper, in this case being a stand-in for kind of those Soviet sympathizing Western intellectuals and journalists who continuously, and continued to at that point, conceal the Ukraine famine. And finally, although I'm not going to go into too much detail, another interesting artifact of this is that, communist reviewers of Animal Farm quickly recognized that Orwell's fiction was a thinly disguised, as they put it, critique of Stalinism generally and collectivization specifically. And these hostile reviews, and they're writing in the context of another famine in Ukraine, by the way, in the mid 1940s, these hostile reviews explicitly reference Ukraine. Now, this leads me to some preliminary conclusions, namely that Orwell repeatedly and almost exclusively references the Holodomor in his nonfiction writing on famine, and clearly drew upon this hidden famine in his own famously anti-Soviet fictional works. Moreover, their specifically anti-Soviet and anti-collectivization bent also appears to have been readily apparent to early readers, including the communist regime's closest Western allies. And I would suggest that the author was thus deeply and dually influenced by both the horror of the Holodomor, but also its cover-up in a way that, like much else in his short life, marked him distinctly from his partisan peers. And I do want to mention briefly some more practical outcomes of the work that I'm doing here. These include an in-depth research article now under peer review at Canadian Slavonic Papers, a curated digital documentary archive employing materials from Orwell's personal papers, and a physical public poster exhibit at the University of Alberta in late October 2026. If you're in town, please feel free to come see it, aligned with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies Recentering the Humanities Conference. To these ends, and this is an interesting process if you've ever had to go through it for your own work, to these ends I've obtained express publishing permission from the Orwell family estate to include in this archive not only these essays that I've been referencing from Orwell's published works, but also materials from his personal papers, including Freedom of the Press, the unpublished Introduction to Animal Farm, and the manuscripts of both Animal Farm in 1984, the original manuscripts, and coupled with additional access to some rare photographs in the same collection, I'm very confident that both the documentary archive and the public exhibit will bring the man and his writings on the Holodomor to more vivid life. I'll end with a quote from the aforementioned Harvard historian James Mace, who once very perceptively remarked that one of the great dangers that Orwell's 1984 warned us against was the manipulation of thought and information, and the ease with which the Ukraine famine has been hidden from the consciousness of the world is a chilling example of what Orwell's book is all about. And this project is really about demonstrating just how true those words are. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prown, for enlightening us about George Orwell's interest and in the Ukraine famine and his various comments on it. Our next speaker is Dr. Ruslan Siromskyi, who is professor and dean of the Faculty of History at Ivan Franko National University of Lviv in Ukraine. His research focuses on the history of the human rights movement in the Ukrainian SSR, the history of the Ukrainian diaspora, and Soviet policy of covering up the Holodomor, that is, concealing the Holodomor of 1932-33, particularly information campaigns abroad. The topic of his presentation is Soviet disinformation and Ukrainian-Canadian commemorative efforts. Dr. Siromskyi.
Thank you, Bohdan. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for the invitation. It is a great honor and privilege to participate in this colloquium. I'd like also to thank Canada for its steadfast support of Ukraine, as well as the Ukrainian-Canadian community for its enduring commitment to preserving historical memory about Holodomor alive across generations. Please forgive me if my English is not always perfect, but I will do my best to present my research clearly. My presentation examines how the Soviet authorities attempted to undermine and obstruct the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Holodomor in Canada. It is based primarily on previously underused archival documents from the archives of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine and the archives of the Soviet Security Services. In the early 1980s, Soviet diplomatic missions and intelligence services in Canada began reporting extensively on the activities of the Ukrainian-Canadian community. According to these reports, organizations such as the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress were preparing a large-scale campaign to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Holodomor. For Moscow, this was much more than a series of commemorative events. The Kremlin certainly feared renewed discussion of the famine, but it feared even more that this history would become part of public memory through monuments, documentaries, public ceremonies, and political recognition. This is a central this is a central idea of my presentation. The Soviet Union was not simply defending its interpretation of history. It was trying to prevent the Holodomor from becoming an international recognized memory. So, what exactly was the Ukrainian-Canadian community planning that caused such concern in Moscow? The actual documents show that the Ukrainian-Canadian community pursued a comprehensive and carefully coordinated commemorative strategy. It was not limited to organizing memorial events. The campaign included documentary filmmaking, monument construction, media outreach, public commemoration, and appeals to governments at both the provincial and federal levels. An important feature of this campaign was that it linked remembrance of the Holodomor with the broader issue of the national rights of Ukrainians in the Soviet Union. In other words, memory was transformed into public and political advocacy. One KGB report from 1983 concluded that the diaspora intended to give Holodomor research and commemoration a long-term character. This assessment accurately reflected the strategic nature of the camp. It is therefore not surprising that Soviet officials regarded these developments as a serious political challenge. Three factors explain why Canada became a particular concern for the Soviet leadership. First, Canada has one of the world's largest and best organized Ukrainian diaspora communities. Second, that community enjoyed access to political institutions, the media, and universities. Third, was capable of transforming historical memory into political action and international advocacy. Soviet intelligence reports repeatedly emphasized the developments. One report noted that Ukrainian-Canadian Congress had proclaimed 1983 the year of the tragic and artificial famine in Ukraine, and planned an extensive campaign involving films, publications, public events, and appeals to Canadian authorities. So Moscow, the Holodomor was no longer merely a historical issue. It was becoming an international political issue. This realization shaped the Soviet response that I will discuss in the following part of my presentation. Identified the Holodomor campaign as a political threat, the Soviet leadership developed a broader strategy to counter it. The response went far beyond simply denying the famine. It formed part of what Soviet security services referred to executive measures, active measures, a coordinated effort combining diplomacy, intelligence, operations, propaganda, and ideological narratives. The objectives were relatively clear. First, to deny the Holodomor as a state-organized famine. Second, to portray the entire issue as anti-Soviet propaganda rather than a legitimate historical question. And finally, whenever possible, to divert international attention away from the Holodomor itself. What is important here is that these were not isolated actions by individual institutions. They form a coordinated state policy aimed at controlling both historical memory and its international information space. Diplomacy became the Soviet Union's first line of response. Soviet embassies and consulates in Canada closely monitored commemorative initiatives and reacted whenever they believed these activities could gain political legitimacy. One particularly important figure was Ambassador Alexander Yakovlev, who served in Ottawa from 1973 to 1983. Also, Yakovlev later became known as one of the architects of perestroika, the archival documents reveal a very different position during his diplomatic service in Canada. In a confidential memorandum written in February 1983, he proposed moving from passive observation to what he described as a neutralization of hostile ideological activities carried out by Ukrainian nationalists. This language illustrates that Soviet diplomacy was not merely representing state interests abroad. It actively participated in efforts to shape historical narratives and counter diaspora initiatives. Diplomacy, however, was only one part of the strategy. Soviet officials also developed a set of standardized arguments that they repeatedly used in public. Archival documents allow us to reconstruct the main arguments that Soviet diplomats were instructed to use. The first was simple: denial. Any executions concerning the Holodomor were dismissed as light and anti-Soviet propaganda. The second argument attempted to undermine the credibility of the diaspora itself. Soviet representatives claimed that Ukrainian Canadians could not possibly know anything about the famine because most of their families had emigrated decades before 1930. Finally, those who spoke publicly about the Holodomor were frequently labeled as fascists, Nazi collaborators, or extremists. If these arguments sound familiar, it is because they represented the classic pattern of disinformation. First, deny the facts. Then, discredited the witnesses. And finally, attack the people raising the issue instead of addressing the evidence. The Lviv historian Andrei Kozitsky is currently researching these issues. The second major instrument involves the KGB and what Soviet doctrine described as active measures. These operations extended far beyond intelligence gathering. Their purpose was to influence events, shape perceptions, and disrupt activities considered hostile to Soviet interests. Soviet intelligence monitored foreign visitors traveling to the Soviet Ukraine, particularly scholars, journalists, and members of the Ukrainian diaspora. Mediterranean Soviet citizens were also questioned about what they had seen or heard abroad. Intelligence services attempted to infiltrate diaspora organizations, spread disinformation, exploit internal divisions, and rely on so-called progressive organizations to promote Soviet narratives. At the same time, Soviet authorities tried to prevent documentary evidence from leaving the country through strict customs inspections and surveillance. Taken together, these activities demonstrate that Soviet intelligence was not simply collecting information. It was actively shaping the environment in which memory of Holodomor could either spread or be contained. Also, they had different code names and immediate objectives. They formed part of the same broader strategy. Operations Pharisees focused on canceling the truth about the Holodomor and countering attempts to document or publicize it abroad. It sought to undermine research and prevent the emergence of credible historical evidence. Operation Payback, officially directed against former members of the Waffen-SS Division Galicia, had a much broader effect. In practice, it contributed to the stigmatization of the Ukrainian-Canadian community as a whole by portraying it as extremist or linked to Nazism. This operation has been studied by Lubomir Lutsuk. Finally, Operation Arsenal targeted Ukrainian diaspora organizations more broadly through surveillance, infiltration, and intelligence gathering. Also, these operations addressed different targets. They shared a common objective, not simply to collect information, but to influence memory, discredit people, and weaken institutions capable of preserving and promoting the history of the Holodomor. Intelligence operations were conducted largely behind the scenes. At the same time, Soviet authorities also relied on a much more visible instrument, propaganda. Propaganda represented the public face of the Soviet campaign. A good example is a press release distributed by the Novosti press agency in April 1983. It was sent to members of parliament, senators, government officials, universities, and Canadian media outlets. The message followed a familiar pattern. It denied the existence of a deliberate famine, attributed food shortages primarily to drought, claimed that grain procurement targets, and argued that reports of millions of deaths were exaggerated or fabricated. At the same time, the document shifted responsibility away from the Soviet government by blaming local mistakes, economic difficulties, and so-called kurkul or Russian kulak sabotage. These narratives do not remain abstract. They were immediately applied whenever Ukrainian Canadians organized public commemorative initiatives. Let me illustrate this with two examples from Canada. The first concerns the initiative to erect a Holodomor Memorial in Edmonton in 1983. The Soviet embassy immediately submitted a formal diplomatic protest describing the project as a gross anti-Soviet provocation intended to distort historical truths and incite hostility towards the Soviet Union. The second example is a documentary Harvest of Despair. After its screening at the University of Toronto, Soviet diplomats protested not only the film itself, but also criticized Canadian authorities for supporting its production. Once again, the documentary was dismissed as anti-Soviet propaganda, while members of the Ukrainian community were labeled as fascists or Nazi collaborators. These cases demonstrate that Soviet diplomacy reacted not only to political statements, but also to acts of members themselves. Monuments, films, and public commemorations were all perceived as political threats because it transformed historical memory into public memory. This brings us to an important question. How successful was this campaign? The answer depends on the time frame. In the short term, Soviet efforts achieved some of their objectives. They complicated international recognition of the Holodomor and attempted to discredit its political support for commemorative initiatives. However, in the longer term, the results were quite different. Soviet attempts to suppress discussion often attracted even greater public attention. They encouraged further historical research, strengthened cooperation within the Ukrainian diaspora, and reinforced the determination of many Canadians to preserve the memory of the Holodomor. In retrospect, the campaign delayed recognition, but it could not prevent remembrance. On the contrary, many of the Soviet countermeasures ultimately contributed to making the issue more visible internationally. And let me conclude by summarizing the main findings of this research. The Soviet response to Holodomor commemoration in Canada was systematic and multi-dimensional. It combined diplomacy, intelligence, operations, propaganda, and ideological narratives into a coordinated state campaign. Second, these measures were part of a much broader Soviet effort to control historical memory and the international information space. The objective was not only to deny the Holodomor, but also to prevent its institutionalization through scholarship, public commemoration, and political recognition. Third, the events of the 1980s remind us that historical memory can become an important dimension of international relations. What began as a commemorative initiative quickly evolved into a matter of diplomacy, security, and international politics. Close. Also, Soviet countermeasures delayed international recognition of the Holodomor. They ultimately failed to stop the growth of public memory. In many respects, attempts to suppress discussion only reinforced public interest in the subject. And finally, studying the Soviet mechanisms of denial and discreditation helps us better understand the historical origins of many contemporary Russian disinformation strategies and practices of historical revisionism. Ultimately, this case reminds us that the struggle, our history, is rarely about the past alone. It is also about who has the power to shape public memory. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siromskyi. And our next speaker is Anneliese Schenk-Day, who is a PhD candidate in sociology at Ohio State University. Her research interests surround political conflict and collective memory, focusing on cases of mass violence, specifically the intergenerational dialogue surrounding violence and its aftermath in countries like Rwanda and Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we've traveled from the 1940s to the 1980s and now into the 2020s, or the current period. Ms. Schenk-Day, please, the microphone is yours.
Amazing, thank you. So thank you so much for organizing this colloquium. My gratitude, as well as CIS US for organizing everything. My name is Anneliese Schenk-Day. I'm a PhD candidate at Ohio State. My discipline is sociology. This is actually a project I'm working on that's ongoing. So everything that I'm presenting today is very much a preliminary result. Nothing's been peer reviewed yet. So I just want to disclose that at the forefront. This is with a fellow PhD candidate at Ohio State University as well, Jack Whipple. The only other thing I want to get off on the top of this presentation is that I do use the term genocide and Holodomor interchangeably. This is because the Holodomor very much is a genocide, but this is not meant to diminish that the current actions of Russia in the Ukraine, in my opinion, does also qualify as a genocide. It just gets confusing during a presentation where I'm talking about both events to refer to both as genocides. So typically when I'm speaking, I'll be referring to the Holodomor and genocide as the same thing, and then I'll refer to Russia's current actions in Ukraine as the current conflict or current war, just to keep points clear throughout the presentation. But again, this is not meant to diminish what happened during the Holodomor or to say that what's happening currently is not a genocide. This is again just stating that we're currently in the data collection stage, so all of these findings are preliminary. And then just to kind of explain a little bit of the background of what our research framing is. Social scientists have held a longstanding interest in how people narrate the past in service of the present via the study of collective memory. Foundational work on collective memory emphasizes its integrative functions, showing how shared interpretations of history can foster cohesion, reconciliation, and collective identity. In this tradition, collective memory can be a mechanism of repair, oriented towards reckoning with a shared trauma, maintaining and sometimes even increasing social unity among members. However, oppositely, there's also substantial bodies of literature that show that collective memory is often shaped by power inequality and can in fact be mobilized towards exclusionary and violent ends. Studies of major historical events and figures have shown how elites and movements, among others, can engage in memory politics that use hierarchy, exclusion, and domination in the wake of major political events. Given the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the Russian state's longstanding denial of the Holodomor, and Russia's longstanding denial of the Holodomor, it is likely that Russia's perceptions of the Holodomor are changing in the wake of the ongoing conflict. Prior work on collective memory shows that citizens of a nation which have been responsible for past atrocities often shift their perceptions of the past to a more positive frame in the wake of current conflict. By rooting our study in the intersection of the sociology of collective memory and genocide denial, we aim to uncover the nuanced ways in which Russians today are framing the country's current actions in Ukraine by recalling the past events of the Holodomor. Such work is necessary to understand the ways in which memory of the Holodomor continues to be actively contested today so that the false narratives can be combated. Prior work on the denial of the Holodomor has focused on historical analysis of political elites' actions as well as nation states' memory politics. While such work is vital to combating denial of the Holodomor, as it documents the crimes committed against the Ukrainian people, it doesn't necessarily explore how such narratives impact everyday members of the public or how conflicts or current conflicts impact Russians' perceptions of the Holodomor. While the Holodomor as a case of genocide is important to study in and of itself, it is highly understudied in the field of sociology, which in my opinion is rather unfortunate given how much can be learned from studying the Holodomor as it pertains to memory studies, genocide denial, and the intersection of these two disciplines within contemporary conflict. Our research is highly impactful as that we are bringing a sociological lens to the study of the Holodomor alongside a unique data set, which allows us to study modern Russian discourses surrounding the Holodomor using rarely accessed demographic variables across studies of collective memory and genocide, specifically age, gender, and geographic region. And I'll get into what this data set kind of looks like in a few slides. In general, we're looking at three guiding questions for our study. The first is, how is the collective memory of the Holodomor as it exists among the Russian citizenry through online discourse? So what does this collective memory actually look like online for Russians. Secondly, we're looking at how the Holodomor's salience and framing changes around key exogenous events. And thirdly, how do different types of users engage in discourse around the Holodomor in similar or divergent ways? We have a handful of preliminary hypotheses. The first being that most discourse about the Holodomor will engage in some form of genocide denial. Secondly, we expect to see exogenous shocks, which activate cognitive ties between nations, which will amplify salience of the Holodomor. So these would be like actions by either Ukraine or Russia in the ongoing war. Thirdly, there will be a rise in discourse co-mentioning states, war, and the Holodomor, so these terms will co-occur. Fourth, exogenous shocks will increase genocide denial by Russian sympathizers as they seek to be framed in a more positive light. And fifth, genocide denial will be more prevalent amongst certain demographics. So, for example, you might see that in regions of Russia closer to the Ukrainian border, you might see more denial. We might see more denial amongst men than women, or we might see more denial amongst older individuals versus younger individuals. This last one is of particular interest to us as across genocide studies, not just in the Holodomor, but this is also the case for the Holodomor. There is not a lot of research on how different genders participate in genocide denial, or how different geographic regions participate in different types of denial. Oftentimes, when we study genocide denial, we look at how whole groups are denying genocide, or whole nations or whole countries are denying genocide, but we don't often disaggregate this information down to like a city level or a county level, for example. In terms of what this data set actually looks like that I mentioned a few slides ago, we're creating a fairly novel data set that has scraped across 3 different social media sites that are Russian. The first being VK. This is a Russian social media site that is most similar to Facebook. It's the most popular social media site in Russia, and it has roughly 200 million users, 60 to 80 million of which are monthly users, so fairly frequent posters or users of the app. Secondly, we're also looking at OK, which is an offshoot of VK, or it's owned by VK. This is really similar to Russian YouTube. It's the second most popular social media site in Russia. Similarly, 200 million registered users, 40 million of which are active or monthly users. And then we're also looking at Telegram. We scraped this using open measures. And with the term Holodomor alone, for example, we see over 24,000 mentions for over a 10-year time period. So we're kind of combining from multiple different social media platforms to get a broader view of what Holodomor discourse on Russian social media might look like. What makes this so novel and important, in our opinion, is that VK and OK specifically are pulling or allowing us to access, or we're able to access the demographics of a lot of their users and posters. So of particular utility and arguably unique to the study of social media data beyond the Holodomor, beyond genocide denial, VK collects and makes publicly available data on users' sex, age, educational status, occupation, and city of residence. This offers a rich set of variables for demographic analysis concerning if particular types of persons are more likely to deny the Holodomor and or connect the current war in Ukraine to the genocide. Such analysis has simply not been possible with prior social media data, with our research being additionally novel given most studies on alternative social media usually look at things like Twitter/X, and these are usually very American-centric or English-centric platforms, and also are not actually as popular or don't have as large of a body of users as these platforms do. So to give you an example of how much data we've been able to pull, I have pictured here weekly post counts, including just direct references to the Holodomor or hunger on VK, which makes roughly 20,000 explicit posts since 2020. So this is just looking at, I know it's kind of hard to see on your screen maybe, but 2020 through January of 2026 is when we stopped pulling this. So, you know, a preliminary search solely of the Russian translation of Holodomor since 2014 to January 2026 returns over 24,000 relevant posts. So you're not seeing about 4,000 of the posts here on your screen at the moment. And this just kind of shows you how prevalent these kinds of posts are. I also want to note that pictured here, you can also see spikes in the spring of 2020 at the early stages of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as well as near all of the anniversary dates for that invasion. So typically in late winter, early spring, you start to see a peak in discourse surrounding Holodomor. And this exemplifies our hypothesis that exogenous shocks will play a role when Holodomor denial Holodomor denial occurs or peaks. We're also looking for other terms. I'm not going to say these terms out loud because many of them are highly derogatory, and also my Russian is very bad. But we are searching for other terms other than just hunger or Holodomor. Specifically, we are looking for hunger for the Russian version of the word because there is no direct translation, but we are searching for Holodomor as well in Ukrainian, for example, to see if it pops up. We're also looking for phrases like Stalin's time period. So often this is used to refer to the universal struggles across the Soviet Union with poverty and hunger. And then we're also looking for terms used by native Russian speakers to talk about Ukrainians. Again, many are slurs, so I'm just describing them. We have a derogatory term used since 2014 that literally translates to dill. We have a derivative of the hairstyle of Ukrainian Cossacks. This is traced to the early 20th century. We have Nazi, a derivative of Nazi, fascists. We have the direct translation of Banderit. This originates from Stephen Bandera, a leader of the Ukrainian nationalist movement. Russians use the term in a negative connotation, often associated with Nazism or fascism. And then we also have Jewish Banderit, a slur against Jewish individuals. In terms of our methodology and what this looks like, it's very broadly a five-step process. First, we run a preliminary topic model to identify clusters of discourse. Secondly, and we're kind of on the second stage at the moment with our process, we code a sample of posts for whether they engage in genocide denial or not. And this is first, we pulled all of these posts basically, and we run them through an AI translation tool, which per our funding, we've been able to attain access to. It's something a lot more advanced than like ChatGPT or anything like that. It's used by international translators. So please don't panic that we're using AI. We were also a little skeptical of it initially. But in addition to that skepticism, we then have a research assistant who is fluent in English, Russian, and Ukrainian check these translations and make sure they're accurate. They are spot checking basically. Thirdly, we'll have a code for each of these themes, and we'll inductively code each one, as well as linguistic features. So we're coding for things like types of denial, but also humor and sarcasm if those are being used in the posts, things like that. Fourth, we train a model to classify at scale whether the post is denial or not. So once we've done this with a small pool, we can move on to a larger number of posts. And then fifth, we train a semi-supervised topic model to identify common themes and clusters of posts. And I'm happy to answer questions about the methodology, but this is more of my co-author's field of expertise. So I will try my best, but I can also pass on questions to him and contact you at a later date if you have questions about the methods. And now for the preliminary qualitative findings. So we've pulled quite a few posts already, and this is kind of the three key themes that we're seeing across posts, including with denial and what these types of denial typically look like. So the first one is contested responsibility. Typically, we code something as contested responsibility when a person claims that the Holodomor didn't happen or wasn't Russia's fault. Often what we're seeing in these are a blame of the United States or other Eastern countries. This first one, the Anglo-Saxons introduced democracy in 1917, and then they turned around and accused the USSR of the Holodomor, claiming that the Bolsheviks orchestrated it, even though they had already plundered the entire country beforehand. Learn your history, folks, and don't even get me started on the Native Americans, on how many millions of them were wiped out. That's shitocracy for you. The second one, as always, American England stirred up all sorts of unrest and bloody revolutions right here on our soil. And while we were busy fighting amongst ourselves and against the Germans, the Yankees were crashing in on our resources and stealing our food, our supplies, In short, it's business as usual, exactly what's happening right now. We kill one another while they pilfer Ukrainian grain and pin it all their sins on us. Nothing new under the sun except for the types of weapons being used. So here we see a blame of Eastern powers, United States and England primarily, some mention of Germans. And then we also see very clearly the link between what's happening in the past in Ukraine to what's currently happening between Russia and Ukraine today. The second main code that we see are a deflection of suffering. So this is coded when claims are made that other people suffered too, and therefore what the Ukrainians experienced during the Holodomor is less valid, basically. So this first one, we see them post that there was a Holodomor in the RSFSR as well, and arguably even worse. For instance, along the Volga, I am by no means a supporter of the Soviet regime, but to accuse Russia of intentionally orchestrating a famine is sheer nonsense. We see another mention of the Volga region in the next post. The famine in the Volga region was more severe than in Ukraine, yet Ukraine is now trumpeting this Holodomor far and wide. And this last one, for your information, the Holodomor took place in the USSR, a state that encompassed not only Ukraine, but other territories as well. During the famine, according to the accounts of my grandmother and my mother, who were living in the Kherson region at this time, close relatives of mine perished. You Ukrainians certainly love to portray yourselves as the sole victims. Study history, real history that is, not the version fabricated by your Ukrainian pseudo-historians. So here we see specific mentions of regions, which is particularly interesting to us as we will again cross-reference these posts with where the poster is posting from, so we can have this geographic reference point. We do think it's more likely that persons living in the Kherson region or the Volga region, for example, might be more likely to deny the Holodomor. So we see that coming up in these posts. And then we also see that because someone in their family or someone they know also suffered during this time period, it means, in their opinion, that the Holodomor wasn't real or wasn't orchestrated by the USSR. Finally, the last code that we're seeing come up consistently is the condoning of the Holodomor and current actions in Ukraine. So oftentimes something is coded as this if we see, people claiming that, the Holodomor either didn't happen or did happen and they think it was a good thing, for example, and want it to possibly happen again or see consistencies between the Holodomor and current actions in Ukraine. So this first quote, the less grub those Ukros have, the sooner their end will come. Back in 1933, they brought the Holodomor upon themselves, and now they're about to do it again. The second post, what's even going to be left for the Ukrainians over there anyway? Otherwise, they'll just start wailing about the Holodomor again. And finally, nothing new here. The Ukrainian leadership will sell off their grain, their sallow, and their black soil and orchestrate an artificial famine. In keeping with good old tradition, Russia will be blamed. It is high time that we simply stopped giving a damn about all this bleeding from across the borders regarding Russia's guilt. We exist, we have always existed, and we will continue to exist as long as this world endures. Yet there are some who simply may vanish. So be it, for truth and God are with us. So again, we see these connections between current events and the Holodomor in these posts, and we see those calling these actions by Russia okay, or supporting it, or wanting it to occur again. I do just want to quickly note that there are some outliers in this, and these are largely accounted for via sarcasm, which is why we will code that in our next step. And this is something that our translator has also, or our research assistant who's fluent in Russian, Ukrainian, and English has also picked up on in checking the AI translation. It is something that computers are not as good as picking up on, is sarcasm, for example. So you do see an example of sarcasm in this first post on the screen. And we also do see some instances of people posting in Russian on these websites, trying to correct other posters, often in response to a post with a lot of false information, trying to explain that it was orchestrated or they need to understand Soviet history a little bit better than how they're posting it. So these kind of end up being outliers in our data set. But with that, I just want to say thank you to our funders, the Holodomor Legacy Initiative Research Grant, which is in partnership with Global Affairs Canada. I have references if anyone is interested. And if you would like to contact me or my co-author after this presentation, our contact information is on the screen. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'd just like to give a few short comments. The talks generally today were from the Orwell specifically in the 1940s, and then the 1980s with the commemorations in Canada and the most recent events related to the war in Ukraine, where social media plays an important role in understanding what is being said in Russia, or at least posted about the Holodomor. One thing that's common throughout this whole period is the question of a free and of a free press, that is, the absence of a free and independent press. And it was absent in the 1930s in the Soviet Union, where the party state controlled information by controlling the media, and by controlling the media, also the narrative. We saw the complicity in the 1930s of certain journalists who went along with denying, or at least belittling, the extent of the Holodomor, but the Soviet state as well prevented journalists from traveling to Ukraine, as we know, in 1933. So the Soviet state, the Communist Party, was involved in these disinformation efforts from the very beginning, from the origins of the Holodomor up, and we see that to the present day from the in the fact that there is no free media in Russia today, and even the social media is very controlled in Russia, so we, although there are opinions that are found in social media in Russia today, I don't know if we can say that there's any kind of free discussion about anything in Russia, which is also the case throughout much of the Soviet period, and beginning certainly with the full-scale war.
I'd just like to thank Anneliese and Ruslan and Bohdan for participating in this online colloquium. It will be posted online, I believe, for those who are interested in watching. And thank you all so much to the audience for your engagement and participation.
Thank you very much, everyone.